The attic creaked under Mark's feet as he rummaged through his late grandfather's belongings. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy window. His fingers brushed against something solid beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Curious, he pulled it out, an old radio, its dials tarnished and unmarked. Mark had always been fascinated by radios. The idea of having to tinker with frequencies to find different broadcasts. So different from just typing in whatever you want on YouTube or pressing shuffle on Spotify. This discovery felt like a gift from beyond the grave. Excited, he lugged it downstairs to his makeshift workshop, plugged it in, and began to fiddle with the dials. Static crackled through the speakers. Mark's fingers danced across the tuner, searching for a clear signal. It took him several tries to get it just right, but suddenly a crisp voice pierced through the white noise. And in today's news, President Kennedy addressed the nation regarding the ongoing situation in Cuba. Mark's brow furrowed. Kennedy? A history channel, perhaps? But as he listened, the broadcast seemed too immediate, too real. It was as if he was hearing a live transmission from 1962. Strange though it was, he assumed he had simply found a channel for audiobooks or plays. And satisfied that at least the radio seemed to be working, he left to go to bed. He spent the next few nights dialing to other frequencies. To his growing surprise, he heard snippets of news from various decades. The moon landing, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Each broadcast crystal clear, as if happening in real time. But he was no expert on how radios worked. Maybe this one was specifically tuned to certain content. How fascinating if an old technology such as this could do that. But on the fifth night, something changed. Mark tuned into a frequency he hadn't tried before, and a familiar voice filled the room. Mark spending another evening alone in his workshop, tinkering with that old radio. If only he knew what he was getting into. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was describing him, his actions, in present tense. Heart pounding, he switched off the radio. What in the world was that? Surely he must have heard wrong. Before he could stop to think otherwise, he turned the radio back on. He was only greeted by silence. Breathing a sigh of relief, he stumbled to bed, convinced he was hallucinating from lack of sleep. The next day, he couldn't shake the memory of that broadcast. Against his better judgment, he returned to the radio that evening. As he approached the same frequency, his hands trembled. "There he is again," the voice said, a note of amusement in its tone. "Hello, Mark. We've been waiting for you." Mark recoiled, nearly knocking over the radio. "Who are you?" he demanded, feeling foolish for speaking to a machine. "We are the guardians of the Wavelength," the voice replied. "Your grandfather knew us well." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "What are you talking about?" "Your grandfather was one of us, Mark. He helped us bridge the gap between times, using radio waves to transcend the boundaries of past, present, and future. But he grew, afraid. He abandoned us, hid the radio. We've been waiting for someone to find it again." Mark's mind reeled. His grandfather had always been secretive about his past. But this? It seemed impossible. "This is a prank, isn't it?" he said, his voice shaking. "If this is for some content, it's not very funny." "Are we?" the voice asked. "Check behind the radio's back panel. You'll find proof there." With trembling fingers, Mark pried open the panel. Inside, he found a yellowed photograph of his grandfather standing with a group of people, all wearing strange antenna-like headgears. On the back, in his grandfather's handwriting, "The Guardians, 1955. Over the next few days, Mark's life became a waking nightmare. The radio followed him, appearing in rooms all over the house even after he'd nailed the door to his workshop shut. He'd wake up to find it next to his bed, whispering his name. He was so haunted by its voice that even at school, he'd hear phantom broadcasts from his computer speakers, describing his every move. He was no longer sure if it was all in his imagination or not. As his sanity frayed, Mark delved into his grandfather's journals, searching for answers. He found cryptic references to the convergence and reality manipulation through electromagnetic resonance. The more he read, the more he realized the terrifying scope of what he was dealing with. The Guardians weren't just listening to broadcasts from other times and speaking to those who would listen. They were actively influencing events, shaping reality and manipulating people's thoughts through the power of radio waves. And now they wanted Mark to join them. "Think of the possibilities," the voice crooned one night. "You could change history, Mark. save lives, prevent disasters. All you have to do is embrace the wavelength. The offer was tempting. Mark thought of all the good he could do, all the pain he could prevent. But then he remembered the fear in his grandfather's journals, the warnings scrawled in shaky handwriting. The power is too great. It corrupts. We're losing our humanity. Mark made his decision. He wouldn't join them, but he also couldn't run forever. There was only one way to end this. He smashed the radio. To his horror, even in pieces, the radio continued to emit that eerie voice, telling him he was making a huge mistake. For a split second he faltered, suddenly unsure this was the right way. But at least he had to try something. So he gathered every piece of the radio equipment that were scattered on the floor and piled them in his backyard. As he doused the bits of metal and gasoline, the voice from the old radio grew frantic. "You can't do this, Mark. You're one of us. You can't escape your destiny." Mark struck a match. "Shut up," he said. "I'm ending this. For good." As the flames engulfed the pile, the voices screamed and distorted, a cacophony of terror and rage. Mark watched, transfixed, as the old radio melted, its dials bubbling and warping. And for the first time in weeks, there was absolute silence. In that moment, he felt a shift in the air, as if reality itself was resettling. The voices faded, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the distant wail of sirens. Mark sank to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew there would be consequences. Questions from the police, concerns from neighbors. But for now, all that mattered was the blessed silence in his head. As he watched the last embers die out, Mark made a silent promise to his grandfather. He would guard this secret, ensure that the wavelength remained forgotten. Some powers were too dangerous to wield, some frequencies better left untuned. In the driveway, someone's car radio crackled to life, and Mark started. But it was only an old song. Mark sighed and tried to put it all at the back of his mind. He wasn't sure what would happen next, and he'd probably be scared of radios for a long time. But for now, the forgotten frequency would remain just that, forgotten. Mark thought he had silenced the voices forever when he burned his grandfather's radio. But 6 months later, on a stormy night, his speakers crackled to life on their own. "We did tell you, Mark. You can't escape the wavelength," a familiar voice hissed through the static. Mark's blood ran cold. He lunged to his table and ripped the cords of his speakers from the wall. But not a minute later, his laptop screen flashed, and the same voice chuckled through the machine. "The same old trick won't work no more, Mark. We've evolved, and now we're coming for you." Horrified, Mark slammed his laptop shut, though he knew it might not do any good. If they could come through any speaker, radio wavelength or no, nowhere was safe. But as if to tease him, the voice spoke no more, leaving in its wake a silence so heavy with dread, it threatened to suffocate him. Over the next few days, the voice's intention became clear. They no longer cared for Mark to join them. All they wanted was to make Mark's life a living hell for rejecting them. Mark's world became a nightmare of ghostly frequencies. His phone would ring with no caller. The overhead speaker at school would spout bursts of static whenever he was alone in the hall. His neighbor's car radio blared warnings of his impending doom when he walked past. Even his microwave beeped in erratic Morse code, threatening to tear his sanity apart. He couldn't sleep, constantly woken by sounds from one machine or another in his house. At first, he tried to stay around his friends, hoping the voice would leave him alone. But somehow they found little ways to torment him. Slight blips on the radio, a sputter of static on the speakers, a fridge that would start humming too loud. He grew paranoid, jumping at every little sound, and his friends started to ask questions. But how was he supposed to explain any of this? No one else could hear the messages, and no one thought these random sounds were anything out of the ordinary. His parents, who were often away for work, also grew concerned at how more and more haggard-looking he became. One evening, he overheard them talking about whether he needed therapy. Only Mark knew the truth. The guardians of the wavelength wanted revenge. One night, exhausted and on edge, Mark dozed off in front of his computer. He jolted awake to find himself in a strange, shimmering landscape. The air hummed with static. and in the distance he saw towering antennas pulsing with eerie light. "Welcome to our world, Mark," the voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere. "The world between frequencies where we've waited for so long." Panic gripped him as he realized he was being pulled deeper into this spectral realm. He tried to wake up, to pull himself back to reality, but the radio waves seemed to have a physical form here, wrapping around him like tendrils. A sensation like a horde of ants crawling all over his skin started to spread up his legs, and his heart almost seized in horror. Somehow, he knew his very essence was being tuned to their frequency, threatening to erase his humanity. "You can't fight it, Mark," the voice taunted. "Your grandfather tried, but in the end, he joined us. It's in your blood." But Mark remembered his grandfather's warnings, the fear in his journals. With every ounce of willpower, he focused on the physical world, on the sensation of his fingers on the keyboard, the chair beneath him. The Guardian sensed his resistance. The landscape around him warped and twisted, assaulting him with nightmarish visions from every era of history. He saw wars, disasters, and horrors yet to come, all broadcast through their twisted frequencies and distracting him from his grip on reality. "Come now, Mark," the voice whispered seductively. "Won't you like to meet your grandfather?" That caught Mark's attention, and his head snapped up. "What did you say?" he asked through gritted teeth. So bound now by the wavelength, even controlling his own voice had become difficult. "Well, meeting might be a bit of an overstatement, but he is here, you know. He is here, in the wavelengths, all around you. He is us. After all, we are not corporeal, nor are we separate beings. Our voice is also his voice, our thoughts, his thoughts. We had transformed him, just like we will transform you." The voice crooned, its tone relaxed as if merely speaking of the weather. But Mark had become horrified beyond words, and he felt bile rise in his throat. So his grandfather had not fallen ill. They had taken his life. With a surge of determination, spurred by anger and pain, Mark let out a furious cry and tried to break free. The swarming sensation had nearly reached his chest, but he fought to keep down his panic and began to imagine a wall of silence, just as his limbs fought against their invisible chokehold, a barrier against the endless broadcasts. He pictured radio waves shattering against it, their messages lost in the void. A searing hot pain lanced up his neck, and his head felt like it was about to explode, but he continued to fight. His limbs felt like they were on fire, and tears streamed down his face. Around him, the Guardians started to wail in fury as they felt their connection weakening. The ghostly landscape began to fade, the antennas crumbling into static. "You can't win, Mark," the voice howled, growing distant. "We'll find another way. We'll always be broadcasting, waiting for someone to tune in." With a gasp, Mark snapped back to full consciousness. His room was silent, save for the gentle hum of his computer. On the screen, a single line of text blinked. "Connection lost. Signal not found." Trembling, Mark stood up. The air felt clear, free from the oppressive weight of hidden frequencies, but he knew this was only a temporary victory. Somewhere in the static between stations, the Guardians were conspiring, searching for a new wavelength to exploit. And Mark decided that this time he wasn't going to wait for them to come back for him. Next time, he was going to be ready. He wasn't yet sure of how, but if he didn't try, he was just as good as dead. He glanced at his computer, then began to type. The world needed to know the truth, even if it sounded insane. Because somewhere out there, someone else might stumble upon an old radio, and the nightmare would begin anew. As he wrote, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him was still tuned to that otherworldly frequency. And in the back of his mind, barely audible, he could still hear the faint whisper of static, waiting. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty corridor as she made her way to the 5th floor of St. Mercy Hospital. As her luck would have it, the elevator had refused to go beyond the 4th floor, forcing her to take the stairs. She'd been working at St. Mercy for 3 years, but this was her first time covering a shift on the half-abandoned 5th floor, where a section was supposedly closed for renovations. The stairs were in that part of the building. The air felt heavy, tinged with the acrid smell of antiseptic and something else, something old and musty. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and discarded medical equipment covered in a thick layer of dust. As she moved deeper into the ward to get through to the other side, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And from somewhere in the dark, she heard a clink. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. But no one else should be up here. And as expected, there was no response. Probably the wind had merely pushed along a piece of debris. She was alone up here, or so she thought. As Sarah rounded a corner, a faint sound caught her attention. Beep, beep, beep. It was barely audible, but unmistakable, the rhythmic tone of a heart monitor. Impossible, she thought. None of the rooms on this side of the floor are in use, and the electricity has been turned off. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had misjudged and she was closer to the central foyer than she thought. Perhaps the sound was coming from the reception desk. But as she sped up, eager to be out in the light, the beeping grew louder, more insistent, closer. Although one part of her was beginning to panic, curiosity and professionalism overrode her apprehension as she followed the sound to a closed door. The nameplate read Room 512. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Unlike the dusty corridor, this room was immaculate. The sheets on the bed were crisp and white, and the heart monitor beside it blinked steadily, its screen displaying vitals for a patient who wasn't there. Sarah approached, her mind racing. How can there be a patient staying on this side of the building? How was this machine even functioning? She checked the power cord. It wasn't plugged in, yet the monitor continued its steady rhythm, the green line jumping with each imaginary heartbeat. Before she could fully process what she was seeing, the room temperature plummeted. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, and goosebumps erupted along her arms. The monitor's beeping spiked rapidly, competing against her own hammering heartbeat, and before her eyes an indentation formed on the bed, as if an invisible body had just laid down. Sarah let out a strangled cry, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. In response, the lights in the room flickered to life, revealing walls covered in outdated medical charts and x-rays. But what made Sarah's blood run cold were the restraints attached to the bed, old leather straps that looked well used and worn. They began to move on their own, tightening around invisible wrists and ankles. A whisper, barely audible, filled the room. "Help us!" Sarah stumbled backward, her back hitting the door. As she fumbled for the handle, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. The x-rays on the wall were changing, displaying grotesque deformities and unnatural anatomies that shifted and writhed within their frames. A skull x-ray turned to face her, its jaw opening in a silent scream. She burst into the hallway, heart pounding. But the corridor had changed. Gone was the abandoned, dusty passage. Instead, Sarah found herself in a bustling ward that looked straight out of the 1950s. Nurses in old-fashioned uniforms rushed past her, pushing gurneys with moaning patients. The air was thick with the smell of ether and the sound of agonized screams. One of the nurses stopped abruptly, staring at Sarah with milky, unseeing eyes. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice distorted as if coming through ancient speakers. "But now that you've seen us, you can't leave." Panic gripped Sarah as she sprinted down the corridor, trying to find a way out. But each turn only led her deeper into the nightmare, where space was spiraling out of control. The end of the corridor warped into a room, and she came face to face with a soldier with gangrenous wounds, his flesh rotting before her eyes. Then a child withered by polio, trapped in an iron lung that wheezed and groaned. A woman whose body seemed to be dissolving from within, her skin bubbling and peeling away to reveal pulsating organs beneath. As she spun and ran, no longer aware of any direction save the need to escape, snippets of conversations and screams echoed around her. "The radiation will cure you, trust me. Hold her down, tighten the belts. It's just a little shock therapy. We need more subjects for the trials." Sarah realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the dark history of medicine. Every unethical experiment, every misguided treatment, every life lost to the pursuit of progress. The walls themselves seemed to weep, stained with the suffering of countless souls. She finally reached a stairwell. Relieved, she yanked open the door, only to find that it led to an operating theater. A group of doctors huddled around a patient on the table, their faces hidden behind blood-splattered masks. They turned to Sarah in unison, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Ah, our newest resident," one of them said, his voice gurgling as if speaking through fluid. "We've been expecting you. It's time for your first lesson." Sarah tried to run again, but invisible hands gripped her arms, pulling her towards the operating table. The patient there began to stir, sitting up to reveal a horrifically mangled body. It reached out to Sarah with a decaying hand. "Please," it croaked, "make it stop." In that moment of terror, Sarah's mind cleared. She remembered her training, her oath to do no harm. These souls, trapped in endless agony, needed help, not fear. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the horror surrounding her. If running wasn't going to get her anywhere, she had to try something else. I want to understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "What happened here? How can I help you?" The scene around her flickered, and suddenly she was in a vast, ethereal space. Ghostly figures surrounded her, patients, doctors, and nurses from across the centuries. Their forms were translucent, shifting between states of health and grotesque injury. An elderly doctor stepped forward, his form more solid than the others. "We are the mistakes of medical history," he explained, his voice heavy with regret. "Souls trapped between life and death, bound to this hospital by the unethical actions of those who swore to heal. Each of us represents a dark chapter in the evolution of medicine. Failed experiments, misguided theories, and cruel practices thought to be cutting edge. But why have you brought me here?" Sarah asked, her fear giving way to a mix of compassion and professional curiosity. "Because you can see us," a young nurse replied, her spectral form bearing the marks of a brutal surgical procedure. "You have the gift and the compassion to help us move on. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone who can bear witness to our stories and learn from our suffering." Sarah spent what felt like hours listening to their stories, bearing witness to centuries of medical missteps and cruelties. A man from the 18th century described the agony of surgery without anesthesia. A woman from the early 20th century recounted her slow death from radium poisoning, prescribed as a cure-all. A child from the 1950s told of experimental treatments that had caused more harm than good. With each tale, the apparitions seemed to grow more at peace, their forms becoming less twisted and pained. Sarah realized that by acknowledging their experiences, by promising to learn from their suffering, she was helping to heal wounds that had festered for decades, even centuries. As the last spirit faded, the elderly doctor turned to Sarah. "Thank you for listening, for understanding, but be warned. The boundary between your world and ours has been weakened. Others may try to cross over, to use the living to continue their work. You must be vigilant." He placed a spectral hand on her forehead, and suddenly Sarah's mind was flooded with medical knowledge from across time. Treatments both revolutionary and horrific, the triumphs and tragedies of healthcare's evolution. "Use this wisdom wisely," the doctor said. "Learn from our mistakes and help guide the future of medicine towards compassion and true healing." With a gasp, Sarah found herself back in the dusty, abandoned corridor of the 5th floor. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window. She had been there all night. Her phone buzzed with worried messages from the hospital staff, wondering why she hadn't checked in. As Sarah made her way downstairs on shaky legs, she knew her life had changed forever. The 5th floor's renovation would never happen. She would make sure of that. That ward would remain sealed, a memorial to those who had suffered in the name of medicine. But the doctor's warning echoed in her mind. Sarah realized her journey had only just begun. She was now a guardian, protecting the boundary between the world of the living and the restless spirits of medical history. And she had been given a profound responsibility to use the knowledge gained from centuries of trial and error to push medicine forward, always remembering the human cost of progress. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed passion. She advocated for patient rights, questioned outdated procedures, and pushed for more ethical research practices. Her colleagues were baffled by her sudden expertise and insight, but they couldn't argue with the results. Patient outcomes had improved. But at night, when the hospital quieted and the shadows grew long, Sarah would sometimes hear the faint beep of a phantom heart monitor or catch a glimpse of a figure in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform disappearing around a corner. The spirits were still there, watching, waiting, a constant reminder of the weight of her newfound responsibility. As she walked through the hospital corridors, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls were alive with untold stories. Every medical instrument, every patient chart seemed to whisper of past triumphs and tragedies. She knew that her experience on the 5th floor had given her a unique perspective, one that bridged the gap between medical science and the deeply human experience of illness and healing. Sarah began keeping a journal, documenting not just her day-to-day experiences, but also the whispered tales and visions that came to her in quiet moments. She wrote of forgotten cures lost to time, of the emotional toll of caregiving across centuries, and of the delicate balance between innovation and ethics in medicine. As weeks turned to months, Sarah's reputation grew. Patients requested her by name, drawn to her empathetic approach and seemingly intuitive understanding of their conditions and openness to explore cures beyond modern medicine. Fellow nurses and even doctors began to seek her advice, sensing that she possessed knowledge beyond her years and experience. But with her growing influence came new challenges. Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the hospital, equipment that seemed to malfunction in specific ways, patient symptoms that defied modern explanation. She realized that the barrier between the world of the living and the phantom ward was thinning, allowing echoes of past medical horrors to bleed through. The others, that doctor had warned her about them. One night, as she was finishing her rounds, Sarah heard a commotion from a patient's room. She rushed in to find the monitors going haywire and the patient thrashing in his bed, muttering in a language she didn't understand. But as she approached, she saw not just the patient, but a ghostly overlay of a man in 19th century clothing, his form riddled with the marks of an antiquated disease. Drawing on the knowledge imparted to her by the spirits, Sarah began to treat not just the physical symptoms, but the spectral illness as well. Her hands moved with certainty, combining modern techniques with long-forgotten remedies. As the patient calmed and his vitals stabilized, the ghostly figure nodded to her in gratitude before fading away. Sarah realized then that her role was greater than she had imagined. She wasn't just a guardian of the boundary between worlds, she was a bridge, a healer who could draw upon the collective knowledge of medical history to face the challenges of the present and future. As she stepped out of the hospital into the bright morning light, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from the darkened 5th floor windows. The phantom ward had chosen her, and its stories and horrors would be with her forever. But now those stories were a source of strength and wisdom, guiding her as she worked to reshape the very foundations of medical care. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to face another day. The weight of centuries of medical knowledge pressed upon her, a constant reminder of the responsibility she bore. But with it came a sense of purpose, a deep understanding that her unique gift could help prevent the mistakes of the past from repeating in the future. As she walked back into St. Mercy, Sarah silently renewed her vow to honor the suffering of those who came before, to heal with compassion and wisdom, and to stand guard against the darker impulses that had once plagued the medical profession. The phantom ward had revealed to her the true meaning of her calling, and she was determined to live up to it, no matter the cost. It's been 4 days since Alex started the night shift at the lighthouse. The isolation didn't bother him. In fact, he relished it, except for one thing. It was the radio. Every night at precisely 2:13 a.m., it would crackle to life with a burst of static. On his first night, Alex dismissed it as interference, but the consistency of the timing soon unsettled him. He reported it to his supervisor, who promised to send a technician but offered no other explanation. Still feeling safe in the light of day, Alex decided to research the history of the lighthouse. He discovered that in 1755, the lighthouse keeper at the time, Henry Winstanley, had disappeared without a trace during a violent storm. The official report suggested he had been swept out to sea, but his body was never found. Alex stared out at the waters, which was beginning to turn a deep blue as the sun began to set. As the night wore on, Alex's unease grew. He started noticing small things out of place. A chair that had seemed to move, a book left open when he was sure he'd closed it. He tried to rationalize it, blaming his own forgetfulness or the wind, but a nagging doubt persisted. Then the weather took a turn for the worse, and right when the gale seemed to reach its peak, Alex heard a pounding on the door at the base of the tower. Heart racing, he descended the spiral staircase, convinced someone was seeking refuge from the storm. But when he opened the door, he found only the howling wind and lashing rain. As he was about to close it, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing on the rocks below. For a split second, Alex saw a man in old-fashioned keeper's clothes, his face obscured by the driving rain. Shaken, Alex retreated to the top of the tower. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew what he had seen was real. The next day, Alex reported the incident to the Coast Guard. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone having been there. They suggested that the isolation might be getting to him and recommended he take some leave. But Alex had only just started here. He was determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. He set up cameras around the lighthouse, hoping to catch evidence of an intruder. Night after night, he reviewed the footage, but found nothing out of the ordinary, and he never saw the figure again. As his shift neared its end, Alex's nerves were frayed. The radio continued its nightly static, a voice occasionally breaking through, always just on the edge of comprehension. He found himself jumping at shadows, convinced he was being watched. On his final night, a storm of unprecedented fury descended upon the lighthouse. The wind howled like a living thing, and waves crashed against the tower with such force that Alex feared it might collapse. At 2:13 a.m., the radio crackled to life. This time, the voice came through clearly, urgently repeating a single phrase: "The light must not go out." Suddenly, the power failed. The lighthouse was plunged into darkness, its vital beam extinguished. Alex fumbled for the emergency generator switch, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for it, he felt a cold hand brush against his own. The generator roared to life, the beam cutting through the darkness once more. Alex spun around, but he was alone in the lantern room. Yet he could have sworn he heard a sigh of relief that wasn't his own. As dawn broke, the storm subsided. Alex stood at the top of the tower, watching the sun rise over a calm sea. He had no explanation for what had happened during the night. Part of him wanted to dismiss it all as stress and an overactive imagination. But as he prepared to leave the lighthouse, handing over to the day shift keeper, Alex found himself hesitating. He felt a strange reluctance to leave, as if his duty here wasn't quite finished. He looked back at the tower one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the top, watching him, but when he blinked, it was gone. Alex walked away, his mind filled with questions. He knew he would be back for another shift, drawn by a mystery he couldn't explain and a duty he didn't fully understand. The lighthouse stood silent behind him, its secrets still untold, waiting for the next lonely night watch. The following events took place at the Cartwright Hotel in 1983, as documented in both police reports and the written statement of James Morton, the night porter who resigned shortly after the incident. The Cartwright had stood on Marion Street since 1926, its red brick facade darkened by decades of city grime. By '83, it was well past its prime, surviving mainly on business travelers trying to save a buck and the occasional tourist who didn't know any better. The carpet was worn thin, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the ancient radiators clanked and sputtered through the winter nights. James Morton had worked the night shift for 8 months without incident. At 47, he was overqualified for the position, but after his divorce, he needed something, anything, to keep him occupied during the sleepless hours. Most nights passed uneventfully, checking in late arrivals, responding to the occasional complaint about noisy pipes, and making his hourly rounds through the empty corridors. On February 15th, the hotel was nearly empty. A midweek snowstorm had caused multiple cancellations, leaving only 6 occupied rooms out of 68. Morton settled in for another quiet night, armed with his paperback and lukewarm coffee from the break room urn. At 1:17 a.m., he heard the first noise, a distinct scraping sound from the second floor, like furniture being dragged across hardwood beneath the carpet. Morton checked the guest registry. Room 212 was occupied by a businessman from Toledo, but 212 was on the opposite end from where the sound had originated. Following protocol, he made his way upstairs to investigate. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he walked the length of the hall. Nothing seemed out of place. All doors were closed, no signs of disturbance. He was about to chalk it up to the building's usual settling when he noticed something odd. The runner carpet at the far end of the hall was slightly askew, as if it had been pushed sideways a few inches. Morton straightened the carpet and continued his rounds. By 2:45 a.m., he had almost forgotten about the incident when the phone at the front desk rang. Room 212. The businessman was reporting strange noises, like someone moving furniture in the room above him. But room 312 was unoccupied. Again, Morton climbed the stairs to investigate. The third-floor corridor was darker. Two of the fluorescent tubes had burned out months ago, creating pools of shadow between the sickly circles of light. He had complained to maintenance about it twice, but they never seemed to get around to replacing them. As he approached room 312, the temperature dropped noticeably. February in New England. The old heating system struggled to maintain warmth in the unoccupied areas. That's all it was. But when he reached for his master key, he froze. Through the door, he could hear something, a slow, rhythmic creak, like someone rocking in a chair. Morton's hand shook slightly as he inserted the key. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. The room was empty, of course. No furniture had been moved. The ancient rocking chair that was supposed to be in the corner was still covered in its dust sheet, perfectly still. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the worn carpet, barely visible in the dim light from the hall, fresh indentations in a curved pattern, as if the chair had been rocking moments before. He backed out of the room quickly, locking the door. As he walked away, he could have sworn he heard the creaking resume. Morton submitted his resignation the following week. In his written statement, he described two more incidents that occurred that night. The sound of footsteps following him on his 4 a.m. rounds, always staying just around the corner, and the distinct smell of lavender perfume wafting from vacant rooms. He never returned to the hotel, even to collect his final paycheck. The Cartwright Hotel was demolished in 1997 to make way for an office building. During the demolition, workers discovered an old maintenance tunnel in the walls, long sealed off, with peculiar scratch marks on the inside of the access panel. The marks were never officially explained. Today, employees at the office building occasionally report strange sounds after hours, like furniture being moved in empty rooms, or the slow creak of a rocking chair. But that, of course, is a different story. Hannah had always been a night owl, so when she landed the night shift job at Oakwood, she thought it would be perfect. The pay was good and the quiet halls suited her introverted self. But on her third week, something changed. One night, while making her rounds on the third floor, Hannah saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform was standing at the end of the corridor. The uniform was pristine white, a stark contrast to the dimly lit hallway. But what truly terrified Hannah was the figure's face, or rather the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a blank, featureless expanse of skin. Hannah blinked, and the figure was gone. She convinced herself it was just a trick of the light, a result of too many consecutive night shifts. But deep down, she knew what she had seen was real. As the weeks passed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Medical equipment would move on its own. Doors would slam shut without warning. And always, there were the whispers. Hannah confided in her colleague, Corey, who had been working the night shift for years. To her surprise, he didn't dismiss her fears. Instead, he told her a story that chilled her to the bone. Back in the 1950s, Corey said, his voice low, there was a nurse here named Elizabeth Marsh. She was dedicated to her patients, often working double shifts to ensure they received the best care. But one night, something went wrong. Corey paused, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. There was a patient, a man with a history of violence. Elizabeth was checking on him when he suddenly attacked her. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Elizabeth died right here in this hospital. Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. And you think she's still here? Corey shrugged. All I know is that strange things have been happening here for years, and they always seem to intensify around the anniversary of Elizabeth's death. Hannah checked the date on her phone. The anniversary was tomorrow night. As her shift began the following evening, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The whispers seemed louder, more urgent. The shadows in the corners of her eyes danced and shifted, always just out of sight when she turned to look. Around midnight, Hannah was called to the third floor to assist with a patient. As she stepped off the elevator, the lights flickered ominously. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly energy. She rounded the corner and froze. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the faceless nurse. This time, it didn't disappear when Hannah blinked. Instead, it began to move towards her, its steps eerily silent on the linoleum floor. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. As the figure drew closer, she could make out more details. The uniform was stained with what looked horribly like dried blood, and though the nurse had no face, Hannah could feel its gaze boring into her. Just as the figure was about to reach her, Hannah heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Corey running down the hallway, his face pale with fear. "Hannah, we have to get out!" he yelled. Hannah looked back, but the nurse was gone. Instead, the lights around them began to flicker ominously. And then, one right above their heads shattered and went out. As if heeding the warning, Corey grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her toward the stairwell. Now, more light bulbs exploded as they ran, showering the hallway with sparks and bits of broken glass. The shadows seemed to chase them, closing in around them as the lights went out one by one. They burst through the stairwell door, taking the steps two at a time. Hannah didn't dare look back and tried to shut out the horrific mental image of the faceless nurse bounding after them in the growing darkness. Just as they reached the ground floor, the door above them slammed open with a thunderous crash. Hannah and Corey ran out into the parking lot, gasping for breath. They turned to look back at the hospital, its windows dark except for a single light on the third floor. As they watched, the light began to flicker rapidly before going out completely. The night was suddenly unnaturally quiet. No whispers, no screams, just the sound of their own ragged breathing. Hannah turned to Corey, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What just happened?" she asked. Corey shook his head, his face grim. "I don't know, but I don't think it's over." As if in response to his words, a single light flickered back to life on the third floor. And in the window, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure in a nurse's uniform, watching them. Emily's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she navigated the winding country road. The clock on her dashboard glowed an eerie 1:37 a.m., reminding her how late it was. She'd stayed at her sister's house longer than intended, and now faced a long drive home through unfamiliar territory. The headlights of her car cut through the inky darkness, revealing a landscape of twisted trees and overgrown fields. A thin mist had settled over the road, giving everything an otherworldly appearance. Emily shivered despite the warmth inside her car. As she rounded a sharp bend, her headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white dress, her long dark hair obscuring her face. One pale arm was extended, thumb out in the universal sign for hitchhiking. Emily's first instinct was to speed past, but something made her slow down. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the isolated location. The thought of leaving someone stranded out here didn't sit right with her. Against her better judgment, Emily pulled over. The woman approached, her movements oddly stiff. As she opened the passenger door, Emily caught a whiff of something unpleasant, like wet earth and decay. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for so long." Emily nodded, trying to shake off her unease. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," the woman replied. "There's a turnoff about 5 miles ahead. You can drop me there." They drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio as it picked up fragments of distant stations. Emily kept sneaking glances at her passenger, but the woman's face remained hidden behind her curtain of hair. As they approached the 5-mile mark, the woman suddenly spoke. "You need to turn around." Emily frowned. "I thought you wanted to be dropped off here." "No," the woman said, her voice taking on an urgent tone. "You need to turn around now. It's not safe ahead." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What do you mean?" "What's not safe?" The woman finally turned to face her, and Emily had to stifle a scream. The hitchhiker's face was gaunt, her skin pale and mottled, but it was her eyes that truly terrified Emily. They were completely black, like empty sockets. "There's a sharp turn just ahead," the woman said, her voice now a hoarse whisper. "The brakes will fail. You'll go over the edge, just like I did all those years ago." Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. What are you?" "Someone who wished someone had warned her," the woman replied. "Now turn around, while you still can." Heart pounding, Emily slowed the car and began to turn around. As she did, she glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty. The woman had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. Shaking, Emily completed the turn and began driving back the way she had come. She didn't know if what she had experienced was real or some sort of fatigue-induced hallucination, but she wasn't taking any chances. As she drove, her headlights illuminated a road sign she hadn't noticed before. It warned of a dangerous curve ahead and advised drivers to reduce speed. Emily felt a chill run through her body. She drove through the night, taking a much longer route home. As the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky, Emily finally pulled into her driveway. She sat in her car for a long moment, trying to process what had happened. It was only as she was about to get out that she noticed something on the passenger seat. There, barely visible, was a damp patch. Emily leaned closer, her blood running cold as she realized what it was. The imprint of a hand, made of what looked like wet earth. Emily scrambled out of her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her house keys. As she finally got inside and locked the door behind her, she knew one thing for certain. She would never pick up a hitchhiker again, no matter how lonely or deserted the road might be. And she would always heed warnings, especially those that came from unexpected sources in the dead of night. The rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt was the only sound breaking the eerie silence as Noah drove down the lonely stretch of highway. It was well past midnight, and he was still 2 hours from home. The fatigue of a long day at work weighed heavily on his eyelids, but he pressed on, eager to reach the comfort of his bed. The road ahead was a ribbon of black, illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional flicker of his dashboard. Trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, scraping against the night sky. Noah shivered, turning up the heat in his car to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through the windows. As he rounded a bend, his eyes caught sight of a road sign. "Mountain Pass, next 5 miles." Noah frowned. He'd driven this route hundreds of times, but he couldn't recall ever encountering a mountain pass. Perhaps fatigue was playing tricks on his mind. The road began to wind more sharply, climbing steadily upward. Fog rolled in, thick and oppressive, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of his car. Noah leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. A flash of movement caught his eye. Something darted across the road. A deer, perhaps, but it seemed too tall, too human-like. Noah's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing slightly on the wet road. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, peering into the mist. Nothing. Just the silent, watching trees and the impenetrable wall of fog. With a shaky breath, Noah turned to make sure his car doors were locked and put the car back in drive and continued on, slower now, every nerve on edge. The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. The fog showed no signs of thinning, and the winding road seemed endless. Noah glanced at his GPS, but the screen showed only static. His phone, too, had no signal. A bead of cold sweat trickled down his spine. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated another road sign. "Mountain Pass, next 5 miles." Noah's blood ran cold. It was the same sign he'd seen earlier. He was sure of it. But how? He'd been driving for at least 20 minutes. Panic rising in his throat, Noah pressed a little harder on the accelerator. The fog swirled around his car, shapes seeming to form and dissipate in its depths. Were those faces peering out at him? Hands reaching for his vehicle? He shook his head, trying to clear it. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. But the whisper of doubt had taken root, growing with each passing moment. The road continued to climb, each turn revealing only more mist and darkness. Noah's eyes darted constantly to his rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling that something was following him, always just out of sight. A low, mournful sound echoed through the night. A wolf's howl, or something more sinister. Noah's imagination ran wild, conjuring images of creatures lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. As he rounded yet another bend, his headlights caught something that made his heart stop. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long and thin to be human. For a split second, Noah saw a face, pale, featureless, with eyes like black pits. He swerved hard, narrowly missing the figure. His tires screeched as he fought for control, the car spinning wildly. For a terrifying moment, he was sure he would plummet off the side of the mountain. The car came to a stop, teetering on the edge of the road. Noah sat there gasping for breath, his entire body trembling. Slowly, stomach tight with dread, he turned to look back at where the figure had been standing. The road was empty. With shaking hands, Noah put the car in drive and eased back onto the road. He drove on, his mind reeling, questioning his sanity with each passing mile. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to dissipate. The road leveled out, and familiar landmarks came into view. Noah nearly wept with relief as he saw signs for his town. As he pulled into his driveway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Noah stumbled out of his car, exhausted and shaken to his core. It was only later, as he was unlocking his front door, that he noticed something that froze his blood. There, on the side of his car, were long, deep scratches, as if something with impossibly sharp claws had reached out from the fog, trying to grab him as he passed. He would never drive that road at night again. And he would always wonder about the mountain pass that appeared and vanished, and the things that lurked in the mist, waiting for unsuspecting travelers in the dark of night. Amanda's eyes strained against the darkness as she drove along the winding country road. The clock on her dashboard read 2:17 a.m. She had stayed far too late at her friend's house, engrossed in conversation and losing track of time. Now she faced an hour-long drive home through the rural outskirts of town. The headlights of her old sedan cut through the inky blackness, illuminating a narrow strip of asphalt ahead. Trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Amanda shivered and turned up the heat, trying to shake off the chill that had started to settle in the car. As she rounded a bend, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance behind her, growing larger as they approached. Amanda's heart rate quickened. She hadn't seen another car for miles, and now one was rapidly gaining on her. The vehicle behind her was driving erratically, weaving back and forth across the double yellow line. Amanda's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Just a drunk driver," she muttered to herself, trying to stay calm. "They'll pass me soon enough." But the car didn't pass. Instead, it drew closer until it was mere feet from her rear bumper. Amanda could see now that it was a large pickup truck, its grille filling her rearview mirror. The driver flashed their high beams, momentarily blinding her. Amanda's breath came in short gasps as panic began to set in. She pressed down on the accelerator, pushing her old car to go faster. The speedometer crept past 70, then 80 miles per hour. The truck matched her speed effortlessly, staying right on her tail. Suddenly, the truck swerved into the oncoming lane and pulled up alongside her. Amanda kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, too terrified to look over. In her peripheral vision, she could see the driver's window rolling down. A deep voice called out, barely audible over the rush of wind. "Pull over!" Amanda's blood ran cold. Her mind raced through horrible scenarios: robbery, assault, or worse. She shook her head vehemently and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck fell back behind her again. Amanda's eyes darted between the road ahead and her rear view mirror. Where were the other cars? Where was anyone who could help her? Up ahead, she spotted a gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. Amanda made a sharp turn into the parking lot, tires squealing. To her horror, the truck followed. She pulled up right in front of the store entrance and leapt out of her car, ready to run inside and call for help. But as she turned, she saw the truck driver getting out as well. He was a large man, his face obscured by the shadows. "Wait!" he called out, his voice urgent but not threatening. Amanda froze, her hand on the door handle of the store. The man approached slowly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "I'm sorry if I scared you," he said, his voice softer now. "But I saw something strange when you passed under a light a few miles back. There was a shadow on your car's trunk. I thought there was something on the back of your car." Amanda's blood turned to ice. She looked at her car, then back at the man, unsure whether to believe him or not. "Let's take a look," the truck driver suggested, keeping his distance to not frighten her further. "If you're comfortable, we can check it out together." Hesitantly, Amanda nodded. They approached her car cautiously. The trunk looked normal at first glance, but upon closer inspection, they noticed something unsettling. There were strange marks around the lock, as if something had scratched the surface and tried to get in, and on the trunk, scratch marks like a huge claw mark was clearly visible. "Oh my God," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. The truck driver frowned, examining the marks. "This doesn't look good. We should call the police." Amanda nodded vigorously, too shocked to speak, but she looked up at the man with wide eyes, thankful for his kindness. He nodded at her reassuringly, understanding. They went into the gas station, where the sleepy cashier was startled by their urgent entrance. "Call 911, the truck driver said firmly. "We need the police here now." As they waited for the police to arrive, Amanda couldn't stop shaking. She kept glancing out the window at her car, imagining what might have happened if the truck driver hadn't intervened. When the police finally arrived, they examined Amanda's car thoroughly, opening the trunk to make sure nothing was inside that shouldn't be. They confirmed that someone must have indeed attempted to break into the trunk, but admitted they were perplexed about the claw marks. "It looks like a large animal, but we're not sure at this point how it made that mark on your car. Maybe it's not related to the break-in. Did you maybe park somewhere in the woods? It might be bear." "No," Amanda replied faintly, not believing what she was hearing. "I haven't been anywhere near the woods. I was just at my friend's place." "Strange, but at least nobody got into your trunk and you're not hurt. Just be careful from now on," one officer told her. "Whoever was trying to get in might have been waiting for you to stop somewhere isolated. This could have ended much worse." As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the gas station, Amanda watched the truck driver give his statement to the police. He had potentially saved her from a terrifying situation. If he hadn't been there, if she had made it all the way home. Amanda shuddered, unable to complete the thought. The police offered to escort her home, but she couldn't bring herself to get back into her car. Instead, she called a friend to pick her up, leaving her vehicle for the police to examine further. As she waited, Amanda realized she would never again take a late-night drive without being hyper-aware of her surroundings. And she would always remember that sometimes the thing you fear might just be the thing trying to protect you.